Hey guys, I'm Hannah, evolutionary astrologer. Welcome back to my channel. And today's video is actually going to be a little bit different from what I usually share here. Normally we talk astrology, right? We talk about the planets and the archetypes and the cosmos and the transits. But even though this video might look a little bit different, and with a lot less astrology in it, it's actually very much connected to astrology because we are currently in the midst of a Mercury retrograde. Mercury has been retrograde, it's in the sign of Pisces. And when Mercury is retrograde, it's always a really great time to go back, to revisit, to take a second look. To take a second look at our conversations, our memories, our narratives, our stories, and even our history, especially because this Mercury retrograde is happening in the sign of Pisces. And Pisces is the sign, it's the archetype that speaks about, that reminds us that it's so much more than just our personal stories and our personal lives. Pisces speaks of the collective, the greater human story. What brings us together? What unifies us? What do we have? We all have in common, despite coming from different places and looking different. What what brings us together? What connects us ultimately? So it's really about the story, Mercury, of Pisces, humanity itself. Um, and it's a great moment to stop and to pause and to ask, is the story that we've been told really the whole story? So this is what brings me to today. Here in the United States, which is where I live, and also in many parts of the world, people are celebrating St. Patrick's Day. It takes place every year on March 17th. So this is the date that traditionally is connected to the death of St. Patrick. And St. Patrick was a 5th century Christian missionary that was very much connected to spreading Christianity in the country of Ireland. So this is, of course, a national holiday in Ireland, but it's very much celebrated in many, many other countries because of, the Irish culture that really spread out, like, in countries like the United States and Canada, in the UK, in Australia, etc. So a little bit of my personal story here, when I moved from Brazil, which is where I was born and raised, when I moved to Chicago, to the United States, I was a very young woman. And honestly, St. Patrick's Day was one of my very favorite holidays because, you dress in green, you go out with your friends, and, the whole city, especially in Chicago, the whole city enters into this really big celebration. There's music and laughter and food and drinks, and people are in the streets, there's the parades, everything feels so joyful, so alive, and very festive. But as I got older, I started asking myself a question. What, who exactly was St. Patrick? What was this dude all about? And what is the real story behind this holiday? What are we really celebrating? And the deeper I looked, the more I realized that the story that most of us hear is actually much, much simpler than the historical reality. And I think most of us don't even really know the real story. So this is what I want to share with you today. What I discovered, the historical context, the myths, the symbolism, because it's full of it, and why this day, St. Patrick's Day, is actually connected to a much, much deeper cultural, religious, and spiritual story. And I think, in my humble opinion, that we really need to take a second look at, which is really perfect for this Mercury retrograde. So let's talk about the basics, the story that the majority of us know. The common story is that St. Patrick was this man who brought Christianity to Ireland, right? This is a very important phrase here. He drove the snakes out of the island. So you see this, if you look at all the imagery around St. Patrick's Day, you see the shamrock, you see the saint, you see, that famous story, the snakes, the famous story of him chasing snakes into the sea. But here's the interesting thing. Ireland never actually had any snakes because of the geography of Ireland, the climate, the weather in Ireland after what happened after the last ice age. It was just not an environment where snakes could exist, in the first place. So there's no snakes in Ireland. So what exactly was St. Patrick driving out? So this is where the story starts to get a little bit more complex. And how the snakes, there's symbolism. This is a symbolism here. So save that thought, and I'll get back to it later. Now, St. Patrick actually existed. He was a real historical figure. He was born in the late fourth century in Roman Britain, not in Ireland. So he's not Irish. But what happened was that when he was a teenager, he was captured. He was captured by these Irish raiders, and he was taken to Ireland as a slave. So I believe he worked as a shepherd for several years. And this is the time when he becomes deeply religious. So eventually he escapes and then he returns to Britain, and then later he becomes a Christian missionary. And that's when he goes back to Ireland. This time he chooses to go back to Ireland. And this is when he, comes with this mission of converting the Irish population to Christianity. Over time, as you probably know, Christianity did spread across Ireland through many missionaries like Patrick. But what gets left out of this story is what existed in Ireland before Christianity arrived. So let's paint this picture. Who was Ireland before Christianity? This was already such a land, an island of a very, very rich in spiritual and cultural traditions that had existed for many, many centuries. This was the world of Celtic spirituality. In this worldview, nature itself was deeply sacred. So the lands, the rivers, the forest, the mountains, the plants, the animals, everything was seen as alive and conscious and deeply interconnected. So people did not experience themselves as separate from nature. They saw themselves as a part of that living landscape, part of that great web of life. So there was this deep relationship with the rhythms of the natural world, the solstices, the equinoxes, the turning of the seasons. And there are many incredible, great Celtic festivals like Samhain, like Beltane, like Imbolc, so many more that were all about marking the shift energies of the year, marking the cycles, marking the turning of the seasons. So the ancient Irish believed that the land was full of spirits of nature, beings that lived in the rivers, beings that lived in the trees and the hills and all the misty landscapes, and many of these beings are remembered today in their folklore, in, for example, the fairies, all these beings that the Irish called the She. uh, and they're not, these small, cute creatures like the modern fairy tales that we have now. These beings were understood as powerful, otherworldly beings. They were the guardians of the land. They were ancient intelligence that was connected to the unseen realms of nature, So, for example, certain hills or certain forests were believed to be portals to the other world, places where the veils between um, the other realities, the between worlds, was thinner. And guiding much of this spiritual life were figures known as the Druids. The Druids, if you've never heard of them, the Druids were the spiritual leaders. They were the great philosophers, the teachers. They were the keepers of the knowledge within Celtic society. They were really the guardians of those teachings. They preserved those traditions. They guided the rituals. They, in many ways, even advised the kings and carried the wisdom of the culture, you know, and they deeply understood the movement of nature and the cycles of nature, the cycles of time, and that deeper relationship between the human world and the unseen realms. So they're not like religious figures. It was very much this combination of intellectual and spiritual, really the backbone of their society. And many of their teachings were passed down orally through memory, through poetry, through songs, through storytelling. And again, that those teachings in that worldview were deeply connected to the land and the natural world. So when Christianity eventually arrived in Ireland, it was not, and this is really important, it was not entering an empty spiritual landscape. It was entering a land that had already such a deeply, deeply rooted spiritual cosmology, one that was profoundly connected to nature and the invisible world. So Christianity came into a place that already had a strong cosmology, strong traditions, and sacred practices. So this is how history gets simplified. And, when cultures changes in the history, many times their stories often get simplified, and these very complex events become a myth or a legend. And as one tradition replaces another, these older layers can fade from the collective memory. But it's a Mercury retrograde, right? We take a second look at things during Mercury retrograde. We dig a little deeper. And this is when we can start to see a fuller picture, right? And question the narrative, question the stories, and revisit the past with fresher eyes. Now, remember that bit about, St. Patrick driving out the snakes, right? To remember that. So when historians and the scholars look at the history, the story of St. Patrick driving these snakes out of Ireland, they actually believe that this is not a literal thing, because, you know, Ireland likely never had snakes in the first place after the last ice age, as I already told you. So here's an interesting question. If there's no snakes, what exactly was being driven out? So what the majority of the researchers believe is that the snakes carry it's a symbol, they carry a symbolic, they're representing these older spiritual traditions that existed in Ireland before Christianity became the dominant force. And if you look to ancient cultures, many of them, the serpent, the snake, was a really powerful sacred symbol because it represented wisdom, renewal, fertility, transformation, rebirth. Think about the serpent, how it sheds their skin, it transforms, and that the cycle really of death and renewal. For example, in ancient Egypt, the cobra was on the crowns of the pharaohs. It was that symbol of divine authority and protection and the awakened spiritual vision. In Greek tradition, another example, the serpent was connected to healing, it was connected to knowledge. And even today, if you look at the symbol of medicine, The rod of Asclepius, it still carries that serpent wrapped around the staff. So when we hear about the story about St. Patrick driving out the snakes, it may be actually describing something much deeper than animals. It may be that metaphor for that gradual disappearance, that gradual transformation and suppression of these older spiritual traditions of the land as Christianity, began to spread across Ireland. So, in other words, this story reflects a very big, a major cultural and religious shift. Now, if we bring this back to today, right, when we look at St. Patrick's Day today, we're looking at many, many layers of history meeting. So there is a story that people celebrate, the saint, the parades, the green clothes, the music, the festivities, right? That sense of joy and community. But beneath that celebration lies a much, much older story, a story of Celtic spirituality, the Druids, a story of the sacred landscapes, a story of that worldview where the land itself was alive, filled with nature spirits, with ancestral wisdom, with that deep connection between the rhythms of the earth. And that story of serpent, that symbolism of the serpent, is very much part of those ancient cosmologies that once shaped how people understood life and nature and the sacred. So there is that, there is this layer, but then there is another layer, the story of what happened when powerful religious and political systems arrive and begin to replace, suppress, silence, oppress, and erase those traditions that came before them. So, in that sense, St. Patrick becomes emblematic of something much larger. It's not just about him, it's not just about one man. He is the face, right? He's the face of a moment when an old spiritual world began to be pushed aside. But this story is not in any way, shape, or form unique to Ireland. The same pattern has happened across the world with many ancient traditions, indigenous cosmologies, earth-based spirituality, the local mythologies were often suppressed, oppressed, demonized, and rewritten as new religions, systems expanded. When one ancient tradition dies, it's a loss for all of us, every single one of us. There are no winners because each culture carries unique ways of understanding life and nature and our cosmos and the sacred. So when those traditions disappear, when they get diminished, when they get pushed aside, when they have to go underground, humanity, all of us, Pisces, every single person loses part of its collective wisdom. So again, I'm going to say this again because it's so important. It's a loss for all of us. There are absolutely no winners here when an ancient tradition dies, especially, Celtic culture, so rich, so full, and thankfully still alive and reawakening. It carries the story of St. Patrick carries deep loss of knowledge, loss of relationship with the land and the sacred, loss of spiritual languages that once helped people understand their place in the world. And woven into this history, I believe there's also deep grief, quiet and deep, deep grief. So during this Mercury retrograde, we are all invited to pause. We're all invited to revisit those stories that all of us have inherited. Maybe this is the perfect moment to reflect on it. And It's not about rejecting them, but it's about understanding them more deeply. Mercury retrograde says, look again, ask questions, and see the layers of what came before, right? Because history ultimately is rarely as simple as the legends that we grow up with. So during this time, every year, every March 17th, when people all around the world are out celebrating St. Patrick's Day, St. Patrick's Feast, perhaps this can also be an opportunity to reflect on the deeper history behind it and to remember that beneath every holiday, every tradition, every story we have inherited, there are often much, much older roots, ancient memories, and forgotten layers of culture waiting to be rediscovered and reawakened. On that note, thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you for being a part of this much larger conversation, this ongoing conversation. If you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, please do. It really helps to support the work and hopefully an opportunity for these conversations to reach more people. And until next time, many, many blessings.